Hey Luke, thanks so much for joining us on Journal Club this week.
Thanks so much, Randall. I'm a big fan of what you're doing at the moment, and I think it's a really important thing and something I'm passionate about is knowledge translation. So trying to close that gap between the research and also implementation into the real world.
That's it. So we've picked a paper, or you've picked a paper this week on running, and the title is the topic is around optimising training loads, and more than just kind of distance. It's a paper that was published in JOST by Max Paquette and a few others. So give us an overview of the paper.
Yeah, so basically where this paper came from is that there's certainly an obsession, and the runners out there, the listeners would know there's obsession with mileage. You know, every runner wants to know, what did you do last week? You know, how much distance did you cover? And what this paper is talking about is talking about the issues that just simply looking at mileage, what that can do, and that it's not really a true reflection of the load on the individual.
So they talk about a number of factors, but they kind of put it into very broad categories: external load, which is mechanical load, and then some internal loads as well. So let's just talk about the external load, just to clarify that at the moment. So that's like mechanical stress. Yep. You explain it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's exactly right. It's the mechanical stress on the body of a particular session, and that's what we look at. Training load is a summation of the external and the internal forces. So the external things are some of the common things that people will use will be mileage, so you know how many Ks that session covered. It'll also be duration as well, so time, but that it can also be things, and now that we've got the world of wearables, we've got a number of things now in terms of impact forces and all the hundreds of things that you can extrapolate from all those. So it's looking at, and that's the more common one used, as we said. Runners just looking purely at mileage. That's the external. And then the internal is where we look at the effect that has on the individual, both on the physiology and also on their psychology as well too. And that looks at things like heart rate, so your different things in terms of heart rate there. You've got your heart rate variability as well. You've got your blood lactate, and you've got your RPE, and so again now with wearables we're also seeing a lot more things coming in that scene as well too. So combination of internal and external variables.
So I wasn't quite sure with the paper. They talk about things such as pace and fatigue and potentially like stiffness and asymmetries and that kind of stuff. So is that definitely like an external load, or would you classify that as an internal load? Again,
it's a combination of both. And what the authors of this paper are talking about is that the importance of combining the two, of using an external and an internal variable to get a more accurate summation of what that training load is. A good example that we can use for our listeners is that going out for a 10K easy run is very different than doing a 10K flat out effort. And if we were just to simply look at distance, they both equal the same. But we know that for a 10K flat out effort, it's physically and mentally exhausting. And so just using that external variable by itself doesn't really tell us much. And that's where we bring into it these internal variables, so things like the heart rate or the RPE, that then gives us a really true indication of what how hard that session was.
RPE is the big one in this paper about perceived exertion.
Yeah.
So talk to that. What do we mean by RPE?
Yeah, so session RPE, it's also as SRPE, you'll see it referred to there, but that's a session rating of perceived exertion. So where that came from was developed from in the early 2000s from Carl Foster, and it was basically an adaptation of the Borg scale, which some of our listeners may have heard of, which was like a 0 to 20 scale, and this just simplified it down. So it's the RPE scale is a 0 to 10, 10 being a flat out max effort, and 0 is not even moving. So I tend to sort of say with my runners, 1 to 2 is like a walk, 3 to 4 is an easy run, then as you're scaling all the way up through there. And so there's advantages and disadvantages to that, and we can sort of talk about that and some of the other ways that you can manage it, or measure that internal and external load. But probably one of the things the key things with a session RPE is you want to be doing it, you want to be measuring it straight after the session. So straight after the run, you want your runner to be jotting down how hard that was, because the longer it goes after the session, they'll sort of tend to forget about it, and they might sort of think, oh, it was harder than what it was. So that's one of the key things about measuring that, is make sure they do it straight away after the session.
We're talking just before we started recording, about heart rate and heart rate variability. And that's something that with wearable tech that we're getting as well. But one of the other things that you mentioned that you can monitor with wearable tech is also the TRIMP score as well.
Yeah, yep.
So tell us the difference between like what TRIMP and also your heart rate and heart rate variability has to offer.
Yeah, so TRIMP's the one that's been used for quite a while, and that stems back to for decades now. That's been used, and TRIMP is an abbreviation for training impulse score. And basically, what TRIMP uses is it's a formula essentially using the heart rate measured during the session, but it compares it to your max heart rate and then the duration of the session. So again, it's one of these things that combines an internal variable of heart rate versus an external variable of duration, and so that's one that's been used for quite a while. Now, one of the things that for our runners out there that use some of these platforms like Strava, like Training Peaks, they actually use TRIMP, and so it's something that if you've got an accurate heart rate monitor, and that's sort of a whole other discussion as well too, but if you've got an accurate heart rate monitor that's working properly, then that'll give you actually TRIMP score for your session, so it's already doing it for you. A session RPE, there's not too many platforms at the moment that are incorporating session RPE into the formula. You can actually record it in there in the platform, but it's not using that score to then to basically create the session RPE. The exception to that at the moment is Strava, and for those that have got, which is a common platform runners will use, but if you've got the subscription version of Strava, you can actually put your session RPE in, and then there's a little button you click that says override the TRIMP score. So that's a good one to use if if your heart rate's a bit funny, if it's not really recording very well, you don't trust the accuracy of it, then you can use that session RPE score instead. So yeah,
that's interesting insight. The other thing they talk about is blood lactate. Now that's something with the elite athletes, like we can kind of take bloods reasonably regularly to see what's happening. But what about for people every day? Like, I mean, you're a keen runner yourself, Luke.
Yeah.
And is that something that you will look at yourself?
Well, that's the beauty actually of RPE, is that it actually quite accurately reflects some of these other measures that in the past we've needed a lab to do. And Anna Saw's 2015 study found a good correlation there between these subjective scores and the more objective ones as well too. So that's the great thing, is we don't need to go too high tech on this, and that's the beauty of using an RPE. You just score out of 10, multiply that by the duration of the session, and bang, there's your session load right there.
That's it. And the other thing I like what the paper discusses is other external things that can contribute to like what is perceived as a harder session, for instance, as well, such as lack of sleep, illness, relationship problems, and that type of thing. That's kind of baked into the RPE, but I was pleased that they actually kind of discussed this in the paper, because as someone who has worked with athletes for a number of years, it has an enormous effect on how hard that session can be, and then that can then physically transfer over into injuries and fatigue and that type of thing. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and that's one of the advantages of using the RPE is that it does give a more accurate psychological reflection of how hard that session was on the individual, and why just taking the duration or the distance it doesn't tell you that, and so that's one argument for using that, and in terms of then you spoke about the other things of fatigue and stress that contribute to injuries. Yeah, and this is one of the things that the authors will acknowledge, is that loading is just one particular part of an injury. Injuries are multifactorial, and that's where we don't have the secret formula yet, because it's such an individual thing. But it's something that really we need to be looking into for every runner in front of us. We need to be taking a loading history, and we need to be looking at things like that to get a really good overall picture of their health and contributing factors. So things like I'll ask all my patients on whether they're athletic or not, sleep. How many hours of sleep do you get a night? Do you wake up feeling refreshed? So yeah, we really need to take a holistic approach to athlete health and injury.
We touched on wearable tech before. One of the other things that they mentioned in the paper is where wearable tech could possibly go, and that's taking some biomechanical type of measurements, ground reaction force, that type of thing.
Yeah.
What do you think wearable tech is good for now, and then where do you see it potentially going in the next few years?
So as a runner, and us runners tend to be very type A and data-driven people, there is no shortage of data out there at the moment in terms of what you can get your hands on. And the accessibility of even just your wristwatches now, the Garmin's and the like, they can give you a whole heap of metrics. I mean, the most common ones being obviously distance and pace, but then also giving you cadence and vertical oscillation, which is the up and down movements. We've got wearable foot pods now as well, which give us sort of ground reaction forces. And I think that where we're sort of seeing is that we may find that certain injuries are more likely related to certain variables. So things like your bone stress injuries might be more related to your impact variables, but other injuries may not necessarily be. And this is where I think we don't again have the secret formula for this, but I think we're sort of looking and experimenting with looking at these variables and figuring out what might be best to look for and delve into with each person.
Still not an exact science, though. I think that there's one quote here from the paper that I thought was really relevant. I'll read it out. Even with the best monitoring approaches, difference in an individual runner's tissue load capacity will always make injury predictive elusive.
Exactly right, and that's where I think it comes back to that holistic approach there. We're asking all the questions about their health overall. We're looking at their movement quality. We're looking at their running gait. We're assessing their strength, their mobility, all these sort of things. And we may find that certain of those qualities and characteristics make them more prone to a specific type of injury, and then you add a certain type of load increase on top of that, and voila, there's your injury. So, and I think the problem with studies is that if you want to be examining all those variables, you need a very large data set. Plus, also if you're looking at the group as a whole, a lot of these things can wash out. So I don't think we're there yet, but there's work being done all around the world to try and delve into it more.
The authors kind of distill it down right at the end to say that potentially to have a very simplistic approach, minutes per run of each session times your RPE is a nice formula just to work for most. Do you agree, or with your runners that you treat, do you like to add just a little bit more to than that?
Yeah, so I do. I think from a practical point of view, and it's always really important to stem this, to boil this down to how people can implement this. But the good thing about there is that there are platforms out there we mentioned that are using things like TRIMP or RPE. So paying attention to those from your runner or for your exerciser out there, your athlete. Yeah, looking at your session, and you can do in your training diary in a spreadsheet, you can simply put the duration, how hard that was out of 10, and there's your score there, and then you sum that up from the week, and then you can sort of look from week to week changes there. So that's from an athlete, but also from a clinician point of view. And I think from certainly in my training, and I still see it today, is that the clinicians probably aren't great at taking a load history. We're all taught the importance of load management, but in terms of when it comes down to it, how do we actually do that? And it's beyond obviously today's chat, but I think from a simpler sense, we can either be looking at the runners' platforms. We can either be giving them a spreadsheet to get them to record these things in, and runners generally love that sort of stuff. Like if you take an interest and sort of say, hey, can you give me access to your Strava account, or I use another platform called Runnerlize, which is free, and using that you can actually look through it, and your runners love it. You're taking an interest in what they're doing, and initially you might look at it and think, well, there's a lot of numbers there, and that's why I said you can get a bit of paralysis by analysis. But after a while of doing it more and more, you'll get the hang of what you want to be looking for there. So I think from a practical point of view, from the athlete, either using looking at those TRIMP scores or using the session RPE into a spreadsheet, and from a clinician doing the same thing, accessing those platforms and or creating a spreadsheet of their own, which is something that I have done.
That's great advice.
Yes.
Luke, thanks so much for joining us on Journal Club this week.
Thank you, Aidan, and again, great stuff. It's been a pleasure and an honour to be on.
We'll be back in a minute after a short message from our sponsor.